Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today. 3Fox presents How Public Sector Procurement is Moving Towards Net Zero, brought to you by the National Association of Construction Frameworks, or NACF. My name is Toby Fox. I'm the Managing Director at 3Fox, the marketing agency for councils. And our job is to keep our network of councils and contractors and developers and investors and their influencers and advisors connected. And one of the ways we continue to do that is through our online channels, platforms for councils and their partners to discuss their ambitions and challenges and influences and issues of urgency. Now, on that note, we'll be back in a fortnight with Rapport 3 and special guests to analyse some built environment growth companies and discover the secrets of their success. You can register for that in the chat shortly. And before that, we're going to be presenting the Direct Delivery Awards to local authorities who are building houses across the nation. But the awards are in London on 24th of May. And if you're a council officer or member, this is a chance to exchange ideas and experience with the best direct delivery teams in the land. And details for that will be going into the chat also. Now, no doubt a lot of the conversation at that event is going to focus on decarbonising housing stock and encouraging low carbon development models. And it's clear that construction has a massive part to play in resolving the biggest crisis we face. The building, operation and maintenance of the built environment accounts for 45% of total UK carbon emissions. And climate change can't be tackled without the full involvement of construction and active behavioural change. And the public sector, with control over 26% of construction work, worth over 30 billion a year, can drive real change. But it's difficult to translate a climate emergency policy into the physical delivery of a care programme, a leisure centre or housing stock. So through its new carbon code, the National Association of Construction Frameworks is hoping it can help clients achieve just that. Now, I imagine there are plenty in the audience feeling that net zero carbon is all too expensive and all too difficult to achieve. And there are probably others at the other end of the spectrum who feel that carbon neutral isn't enough and we need to be looking at carbon negative. So in line with the NACF's mission by the public sector for the public sector, we've assembled a panel today to guide us through what's actually happening in this field, what practical tools are available to you and how you viewers can do something effective right now. And to that end, it's a pleasure to welcome to the discussion today in alphabetical order, Sarah Barnes, who's pre-construction and marketing manager at Interclass, a contractor partner on the Constructing West Midlands framework, a member of the NACF. Also Emma Bull, who is framework manager at SCF, and Chris Clark, who is performance and improvement director at Scape. And Emma and Chris are the NACF carbon and environmental leads. We also have Gavin Marshall, who's Sustainable Procurement Manager at Orbis Procurement, and Dr. Jennifer Schooling, OBE, who's Director of the CSIC, or Centre for Smart Infrastructure and Construction at the University of Cambridge. Now, what a panel. I'd encourage you to make the most of them, viewers, by firing in your questions through the Q&A function, and we'll address as many of those as we can during the course of the conversation. We also welcome your observations in the chat, of course. So let's get that discussion started by asking our first question. Why is net zero a significant target for your organisation, and what steps are you already taking towards it, and where are the biggest challenges? Sarah, let's start with Interclass.
Thanks, Toby, and it's great to be here part of this webinar today, so thanks for having me. I think the simple answer to that question is all individuals and organisations have a responsibility, and none more so than those working in construction and the built environment. From Interclass's perspective, as a contractor on an NACF framework, again, we've got a responsibility, we've got a duty to lead by example and to support the drive for low carbon construction, both up and down the chain. So we're in a position where we can influence our supply chain, but we can also influence our clients and the design teams as well, and hopefully position ourselves as a leader for other SMEs and contractors to follow suit. And I guess another reason why it's an important target for us is exactly the reason why we're here today, because the way projects are being procured and the way contractors are being appointed is changing, rightly so, and we've all got a role to play in that. So the marketplace is demanding it, not just from clients, but also our own employees. It's no secret that consumer behaviour is changing, and that is coming into the workplace as well, and the decisions that are being made. And simply, if we don't act, if we don't take action now, then we're just going to get left behind. And going back to sort of the marketplace we're operating in, my role is predominantly pre-construction. So I've seen firsthand how it's evolved. You know, we're getting asked at tender stage to demonstrate our long-term strategy, our commitment to achieving zero carbon, with that particular project in mind. And there lies the opportunity, really. We know as a contractor we can influence what we build, we can influence what our supply chain are building, what materials they're using, and also what the client decides to build to some extent. But also recognising that those decisions have to be made from the outset as well. And that's really why we've pledged to take action by signing up to the code, amongst other things, which I'm sure we'll talk about later. But of course, it's not straightforward. There are challenges. There's a lot of information out there. There's a lot to get to grips with. There's a lot, organisations have been asked for a lot, especially SMEs, who are also facing other challenges at the moment with current issues around material shortages and price volatility. So there's all that to consider. And as with everything, cost plays a part. Who pays for the additional things that we're being asked for? You know, having the expertise and the resource to measure things like embodied carbon at every step of the design and construction process. But it's also the cost and time associated with changing designs to be more carbon friendly as well. Sometimes that can be a wasteful process. And there's also a concern about procurement still being based around lowest price. At the end of the day, clients have budgets and we have to meet that. But the point that I really want to get across is that carbon saving does not have to involve a huge expense. It's all about shifting the way we think and talk about carbon and focusing on maximising that whole life value instead. If clients are consistently choosing value over cheapness, then we can perhaps avoid the race to the bottom. So that's why it's important to keep talking about examples which clearly focus on why it's a no-brainer in terms of programme and cost efficiencies as well. You know, it doesn't have to cost more, that's the key message. So I'll just end on just an example of a project that we are currently delivering at the moment at Wolverhampton College. So we came on board under a two-stage procurement process. We worked with the client to influence the design and fundamentally changed the design solution. And the project involved a new mezzanine. We replaced the concrete base structure with 100% recycled timber chipboard. We also reduced the amount of steel used by opting for an off-site manufactured mezzanine solution, which was made in a local factory just down the road. So not only did that saved carbon, I think it was about 70 tonnes of CO2 that we calculated that design change saved, but it also saved time on the programme. It caused the college less disruption because it was made off-site, and it was cheaper as well, so the college it freed up some money to spend elsewhere. So it really demonstrated value for money, and it worked really well in this scenario. The client was the end user, which I think always helps, and everyone was on board, and the benefits were clear, and it met all the key drivers that the college were after.
Fantastic, Sarah. Thank you very much for that. Lots of nodding in the panel, and I imagine in the audience as well. Just to wind back to one of the things you said there, are you finding that you've got more opportunity to advise clients because of the climate crisis, because you're the sort of receptacle of knowledge on this? Are you finding that there's a sort of more creative role for the contractor in a project now?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think being part of an NACF framework as well, where we are getting approached to look at projects much earlier on in the process, and that's given us the facility, I think, to have those conversations that sometimes we have much later down the line, and by that point it's almost too late, because that design's been approved, the client, the end user have got that in their head, that's what it's going to be, and then to go back and go through that approval process again, it's time consuming, it's costly.
Thanks, Sarah. Does that resonate with you, Emma, at the SCF? And maybe you could tell us a bit about the kind of carbon journey that you've been on.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, just to reflect what was said then about NACF clients. by choosing an NACF framework, then you are expecting obviously legislation to be covered, but for carbon to be high on the agenda. And I think without exception, in my experience, those NACF partners and contractors do have it high up on the agenda. And because of that, I think that's certainly what's driven our drive as a framework, and certainly our partnership with NACF to have a look at this as a topic, as we have been for many, many years. But actually drive it quite a way forwards, accelerate it in a pretty short time. So why we need to respond to the net zero target is because of the legislation requirements, and because clients are asking us those questions, and how we deliver that through the framework. And I think we need to, obviously, one of the first pieces of work that we do is define the differences between operational and in use, and obviously that then will drive the design going forwards. So one of the first steps we took when we started forming our CERG, Climate Emergency Response Group, which is a working group comprising of our expert partners and those strategic managers within our expert partners, main contractors and consultants, is to have a look at what information was out there to help our clients on this journey. So the first thing that we did to respond to it was create what's called our client tool. It's misleading calling it a tool. It's an information PDF, interactive PDF. And that goes into myth busting, into the terminology. It talks about what's embodied and in use. And it talks about the LETI framework and all the other things that clients will hear. We're not practitioners necessarily in this environment, in this world, bit of a pun there, but it gives them an insight into demystifying carbon and what they're being asked to do. And critically for us with this tool, how that can be influenced. So our tool then goes into the elemental part of a typical construction project and talks about what areas can be identified that will have the highest hitting carbon effect and what the consequential effects of that are, because we're in construction, everything we do has a consequential effect as we're reviewing designs. So that's for clients, that's for consultants, that's for stakeholders, that's for anybody that's influencing the design, and that's something that we've shared widely across the construction sector. It sits on our website, but it's available for absolutely everybody. And one of the challenges that we have come across, and we've certainly identified this prior to undertaking the code, but certainly the code has driven us towards this under the NACF, is the consistent data reporting, and it's to make sure that there is a baseline. I'll talk a lot more about that later. We've done quite a bit of work with the NACF partners. Myself and Chris have worked quite closely on this, but that was the biggest challenge for us, is make sure there's a consistent level of information. It doesn't necessarily always need a sustainability consultant to do that initial assessment, but from us, A, it gives us a baseline, and B, it marks those improvements in design, or in many cases, the design actually can be badly affected by the decisions made as far as carbon's concerned. We need to find trends, we need to identify baselines, and we need to make sure there is a consistent way of benchmarking. So the first thing we did was a client tool, and the second one we'll talk about a little bit later. Yeah, and I have a case study, sorry, Toby, on the website. Yeah, we have had a contractor to undertake this tool for us, and it's sitting on our website. But again, I can talk about that a bit later on.
Great stuff. Yeah, I'm looking forward to getting into that that new tool. The carbon tool that Emma was talking about, there's a link to that in the chat now, viewers. Chris, tell us a bit about your carbon journey at Scape and how it sort of differs and mirrors what we've heard already.
Thanks, Toby. Yeah, I think from Scape's perspective, the context for us and all of the NACF members are the same, as we're all owned, managed, or membership organisations that the public sector controls. So we are public sector for the public sector. And I think one of the things that, from our perspective, our local government owners all have declared a climate emergency. They have like 300 other plus local government organisations. And specifically in Nottingham City Council, who are one of our 6 owners, they've set a target of being a net zero place by 2028. And that is an extraordinary challenge. It is an extraordinary deadline, but it is what's necessary. So from our point of view, we were inspired by our owners' commitment politically, but we know technically that I think, as you said in your introduction, reaching net zero is a challenge for is a challenge because the construction industry, construction procurement, is heavily regulated and technical. So we recognise that, and we took that on as a moral responsibility, almost to say, well, we are an organisation that procures for hundreds of public sector clients in the same way that the other NACF members all have that sort of scale of buying, and therefore we really do need to get this right. We need to take a lead on it. So collectively, we took that attitude, and within Scape, we asked ourselves the question: what are we going to set our own standards to be? And as procurement organisations, we're asking ourselves the question: is what are the standards we're going to put through procurement, and in what stages will we apply them? So it's a big responsibility in the procurement setting, because what we do trickles down. So what the rules that we establish through procurement, through framework procurement, trickle down into supply chains. So if we ask for carbon reduction plans from the main contractors as organisations, that obligation will trickle down into their supply chains. If we ask projects to be developed with a carbon management plan within the project, that responsibility will be taken on by the main contractor, but passed through into the supply chains that make the things that go into our buildings and design the buildings. So so we know that we're dominant. There's a domino effect through supply chains. If we push, then everybody follows, and that's happened a number of times before around the CDM regulations, health and safety regulations. There's a number of changes in regulation over time that we've all championed, and change happens. Social Value Act is a great example of that. We're 10 years on from the Social Value Act, and we've seen a real change in the sector and in the country as a result of social value-based procurement. So from our point of view, we took quite a long, hard look at the sector and decided what our minimum standards should be. Scape procures direct award frameworks. We tend to procure from the national scale organisations rather than regional contractors. There is a good variety across the NACF of access to different contractors. So from Scape's perspective, we went and spoke to our supply chain, our incumbent and beyond our incumbent supply chain, sort of 3.5, 4 years ago, before we went through our national procurement construction framework. And we sort of asked the supply chain, if we raise the bar to the level we think we need to for the climate emergency, 1, can you cope? 2, do you all want us to? Because we didn't want to go to the market with the unachievable, but we also didn't want to be unambitious. So we looked at the requirements that we should go into that procurement round. We looked at the scientific arguments, and we ultimately settled on the challenge for the contractor community we procure of supporting the adoption of the REBA 2030 climate challenge goals, which are designing all new buildings by 2025 to net zero and constructing them by 2030, 100% building. Big challenges, but we wanted to make sure we procured both contractors and designers with the capability to meet those targets, even if clients weren't ready to ask for them. So our minimum standards we've gone into these frameworks with are reaching technical capability, but the minimum standards apply to the regulations. So we've applied the PAS 2080 carbon measurement requirement into our frameworks, which is just saying we need to have carbon literate businesses working with clients. And we've also used PAS 2060, which is around the carbon management in projects. So we're saying as a minimum requirement, we expect our supply chain to be capable of meeting those standards. And then in delivery, we've been more aspirational and said some clients will come to you and ask for net zero tomorrow, and you need to be able to respond to that. Others will take longer. So in terms of what we've done at Scape with our national frameworks, we've taken that view that we raise the bar on the minimum standards, and then we promote to our members and clients.
And Chris, in that process, so when you're sort of confronting the industry with that, you're talking to the top tier, aren't you? You're saying to the top tier, are you comfortable with this? Are you going to be able to deliver to that? But you're relying on them to be able to talk to the supply chain.
Absolutely, and I think this is a really important point. And Emma and I will come back to embodied carbon and materials, but the contractors do most of the buying. The main contractors spend far more money with the supply chains and the small businesses in construction in the UK than the clients do. Yeah. They're the ones with the buying power, so we have to influence them to get the change we want. So we took a view that would be our battleground. We'd take that challenge on, that'd be the level we work at.
Thanks, Chris. So we've got lots of threads now. We've got the idea of, you know, the whole point around costs and the drive to the bottom versus trying to procure with value in mind. We've got that whole myth busting and demystifying challenge. We've got the deadlines, you know, the immediate for the need for really rapid and immediate action, and the need to set some standards and allow those standards to kind of ripple through the whole industry. Turning to Gavin at Orbis, I'm really interested to hear on, you know, the particular challenges you faced and how all of that resonates with you, and whether there's any difference in your experience of all of this.
Yeah, sure. So Orbis essentially is a mix or a partnership of 3 different local authorities for anyone that isn't aware of who we are. That's Surrey, East Sussex and Brighton and Hove councils. We're all working together on our sharing a procurement service, and across all 3 authorities, we've each declared a climate emergency, and there's sort of expected further legislation pressure coming down the line. There's strategic priorities in each of the councils to tackle climate change and create greener communities for the citizens that live in our locality. So we've got quite a few ways to sort of tackle this issue that we're coming around, and there's sort of dedicated teams in each of the 3 authorities, and we're looking into our procurement at Orbis. We're already starting to implement quite a few measures to tackle this. So one of those is a policy that I'm currently working on, which is spanning across the 3 different authorities, which doesn't just look at climate change. It looks across sort of all the environmental aspects that you could consider in procurement. So biodiversity, pollution, resource use, that kind of thing. And we're starting to really sort of level up our own requirements in new tenders. And we're hoping to slowly bring along our supply chain with us. And that includes the smaller SME suppliers. We don't want to leave them behind at all. We've also started to implement the recent PPN 0621 it's not mandatory for local authorities, but we've decided to take it on to ask that requirement of, do you have a carbon reduction plan for our high value contracts? And we're hoping to at some point lower the threshold for that, you know, so that we can include more contracts. So it's really a first step to how we can tackle this issue. And then we're increasingly looking to build other targets and expectations into our procurement activities, sort of start asking a bit more challenging questions, and then sort of build up on that.
I'm hoping, Gavin, you've actually answered an anonymous question from the audience, and Chris has been writing an answer to that as well. Can you just unpack very slightly for us what you mean by PPN 06/21, and then Chris, I think you wanted to come in after that.
Yeah, sure. So that's a requirement that's been built in for central government organisations to request for carbon reduction plans for any procurement activity that goes over £5 million a year. So that's not just construction, it's across sort of all things that central government might buy. And that includes the carbon reduction plan itself looks to see what the scopes, all 3 scopes are of an organisation for each bid for this sort of contract work. It's a public commitment to go to net zero for at least 2050. It needs to be signed off by a director or senior equivalent. And it's a way for organizations to bid in, and then it's either a pass-fail. So if one of those aspects isn't met, if you don't currently know what your sort of at least scope 1 and 2 emissions are, if you're not signed off by a senior executive, if it's not been published on a website, then you can be disqualified from the tender. And loads of other public body organisations are starting to implement this. The NHS is looking to implement it. If they've not implemented it already, several local authorities are starting to implement it, including ours.
Great stuff. Thanks, Gavin. Chris, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, I think we are, and I know SCF and a number of the other NACF members are all in the same place on that we are all pushing towards the PPN 0621 being adopted consistently. we've done it for our national frameworks, and we're annually inspecting the action plans and reviewing those so that our clients get the benefit of that check. But I think the one thing to note is that in introducing that requirement, we have to be quite responsible about the pace of change and how quickly we do it as a collective group, because the larger organisations have the commitment, the wherewithal and the resources to have started already. But there are plenty of supply chain organisations who are much earlier on their journey, and we have to be really mindful of that. So, and that's not just, so even within the NACF, we haven't been able to take an instant blanket view, but as a group, we're all working towards that carbon reduction plan being a baseline that we've all achieved as framework providers over the next few years. But the challenge for us is that each of us can only introduce that as we renew our frameworks. So we can only do it at the moment in time when we have that opportunity. Although the government's been clear that progressive improvement to frameworks is entirely possible through managing it. But that said, it's something that will come over time. So it's important that we recognise it's a journey, but it's also important that we recognise that PPN, all it does is put into government procurement the application of the rules that are in law in terms of getting to net zero by 2050 is the UK. So it's a positive move.
That is a really good note to on which to turn to Jennifer. Now, Jennifer, you've been very, very patiently sitting through the discussion so far, and I'm hoping that this has acted as a sort of big build-up to the main event, which is the sort of revealing of the carbon code. But we've heard a bit about the journeys that frameworks and contractors and clients have been on in introducing net zero measures and moving towards low carbon development. We've heard a bit about some of the tools and the measures that they're introducing as well, but also about the challenges that they're facing. So why do we need yet another tool? Why do we need this carbon code, and what does it do?
I will get into that, but just before I do that, I'm going to mention another tool very briefly. There was various people mentioned as we were as the discussions were progressing, some of the challenges with procuring not just for cheapest cost, but for wider value concepts. There is another tool, and hopefully Natasha's going to stick the link in the chat, called the Value Toolkit, which was developed by the Construction Innovation Hub. Now, it won't be appropriate to everyone, but it's a tool worth going to have a look at, because it looks at how you can balance those procurement requirements across environmental, social and cost aspects. So it's much broader than the specific carbon issue that I'm here to talk about, but it's another potential tool that one could use where you feel it's appropriate. So it's worth going and having a quick look. They've presented it in a really nice, easy to consume way. I understood it, so it's
thanks, Jennifer.
It's a good thing.
That link is in the chat now.
Yeah. So but on to what I'm really here to talk about, which is the carbon code. And I'm just going to share my slideshows. As Toby said, I'm here to really introduce the carbon reduction code for the built environment. Now, this is something that we developed in CSIC. So CSIC is housed in the University of Cambridge, but we work very closely with industry partners. And actually, this was an initiative of us with our industry partners, but under the umbrella of Construct Zero and Construction Leadership Council. And really, this comes from what we do in CSIC. So in CSIC, we look at how can we better understand and manage our various built environment assets, whether that be hospitals or schools or railways or highways or what have you, through having better data about them. And Lord Kelvin said it perfectly a century and a half ago nearly now: if you don't measure it, you can't improve it. So we're very focused on learning from the real performance of both our construction processes and our and the sort of general performance of our assets, so that we can feed that back into design, into improved construction and into improved services from our built environment assets. And this measure, monitor and reduce element that I've got down the bottom here is really crucial to the sort of core plank of the carbon code. And it came about, as I said earlier, through a collaboration between ourselves and 30 of our industry partner organisations. And it's essentially a framework for organisations to make a public commitment towards net zero and report on progress towards it. But also to collaborate together. So there are three parts to the code. One is core commitments, which I'll go into and describe. Then there is a set of commitments for client organisations and a set of commitments for supply chain organisations. And depending on what level of commitment you go to, you can sign up either as a pledger, a signatory or a champion. And if you're a signatory or a champion, then that implies that you are working with your supply chain and potentially with your clients to help them achieve net zero goals as well. So SMEs, we would largely expect to sign up as pledges, but the various construction framework organisations have, some of them have signed up as signatories and champions. So it's an opportunity to sort of bake in the fact that we want to work together. What differentiates it from some of the other things like engineers declare and architects declare and what have you is this requirement to report and to have a plan, which also helps to then align with PPN 0621, which came up just now in dispatches. So it was drafted by our Achieving Net Zero Industry Working Group with more than 30 professionals from across the sort of built environment spectrum, if you like, from clients through to main contractors, and we had a couple of SMEs in there as well. And importantly, we had Peter Yates from NACF. We did some trials of it before we published it. So NACF, the Environment Agency, and Skanska all trialed it in-house to see how they would meet it. And we've also made sure that it's aligned with and supported by the Construct Zero initiative. And it's a way of meeting the PPN 0621 requirements. And I'll explain why that is in just a moment. And it also references PAS 2080. So for those of you who are actually sort of in the weeds of construction, you may have heard of PAS 2080, which is about carbon management in construction. And that is, it was first published in 2016. It's about to have an up issue release. People have been working very hard on that in the background. And that is very much about, how we manage carbon through the construction process. So the core commitments for the code are twofold. One is to set out plans to meet net zero by 2045. Now you'll note that's different to 2050, and that's because this is a UK-wide thing and Scotland has a current target of 2045. So we'll set out plans to meet net zero by 2045 and include annual targets that recognise that the majority of cuts need to be made by 2030. And crucially, we'll publish the plan and our progress annually. Now, obviously, as people initially sign up, the first year, it's okay just to have the plan. But after that, we expect annual reporting. And then as part of that, we'll set an interim target to reduce our net direct and indirect carbon emissions for 2030, which aligns with or exceeds the government strategy of meeting net zero by 2050. And recognising that the preference is to reduce emissions rather than offset. We may or may not discuss offsetting later. It can be a bit of a contentious issue, but the key thing here is to reduce our carbon emissions as fast as possible, because carbon persists in the environment in the atmosphere for 100 or 200 years. So every kilo that we emit today will still be there warming the planet for another 100 to 200 years. So the quicker we can reduce our carbon emissions, the better. And for any major projects that finish before 2030, then a suitable target will be set for the end date of the project. So those are the core commitments that any organisation signing up to the code makes. There is then this range of client commitments and supply chain commitments. And I realise you can't see those, but there'll be a link in the chat that you can click on to actually access our code front page. And if you click on the read the code here link in there, then you'll bring this up. And essentially, on both the client and supply chain side, there's a set of core commitments which enables you to sign up as a signatory, which is all about including carbon reduction targets and reporting commitments explicitly in procurement documents. So if you sign up as a client, as a signatory, then you're meeting PPN 0621 or whatever it was. And then committing to baselining projects and having data externally verified. And then there's the further commitments piece is around then working together as client organisations or with the supply chain to have a shared data set for carbon. Because one of the challenges that was discussed a lot when we were developing the code was around actually, everyone asks for different things and we've nowhere to share our data that's sort of, consistent. So that's something that the industry is working on having. So the further commitments are to share data in that way. As I said, there's a website that you've got the link to, and it's also in the slides, which will be shared afterwards. And if you go to the carbon reduction code, there's a whole piece on the compliance process, but the introductory page has a link to the code itself. And you can sign up as pledge, signatory or champion. This was developed with the help of, as I said, a lot of people most of whom I think are named here. If anyone's missing, I apologise to them. But I wanted to give special thanks to Janet Greenwood and Keith Bowers, because we cooked up the Achieving Net Zero group, who then created this over a drink in a pub around King's Cross. And without that conversation, none of this would have happened. So just goes to show that that meeting in person stuff that happened before the pandemic is really worthwhile. I'm going to sign off here in terms of the presentation, but one thing I would mention as well is that there's been a lot of mention of the challenges for SMEs in this space. And I think that the clients and the frameworks have a lot to do to support SMEs potentially, as do the major contractors. But we're also very cognizant of this, and we've got the Supply Chain Sustainability School now working with us to look at what parts of their offering can be, you know, actually align with the code and can help SMEs and others, obviously, to meet the requirements of the code. So with that, I will stop sharing.
Thanks, Jennifer.
Just come back to you, Toby.
Yeah, just to ask you, if you sign up to the code and you don't meet your obligations, what happens?
Then you cease to be a signatory. So on the website, we have a page of signatories, or pledges, signatories and champions. Basically you have to resubmit every year, and you have to submit the evidence that you have, that you're counting the numbers. And if you can't do that, then you lose your status.
So the objective is that clients are looking at that list and they're preferring organisations that are signatories and are progressing towards net zero.
Yes.
Yeah, great stuff.
You know, recognising that people are going to get there at different rates, but that we all need to go as fast as each of us can.
Yeah. Can you just give us in as pithy a way as possible the reason why we need this code, as well as PAS 2080 and the SCF carbon guidance and PN whatever it was, and all the other sort of initiatives there are out there?
So this is about getting people to actually have a plan, publish it, share it, publish progress, and then where people can collaborate together, because we will go so much faster if we go as an industry. You know, speaking about the supply chain, some of the big contractors out there are already making great progress. If we can get them to hold the hands of their supply chain and bring them with them, then those supply chain members will get there much faster. This is not a space in which we should be competing. It's a space in which we have to collaborate. If you look at the remaining carbon budget to have a 1.5 degree world, and how fast as a planet we're spending that carbon budget, we will have to stop emitting carbon in 2028 to have a 60% chance of having a 1.5 degree world, unless we start reducing carbon now.
And that's tomorrow, basically, isn't it?
It is pretty much tomorrow, yeah.
Sarah, where does it fit into to your operations? What's your experience of the carbon code and how useful it is?
Yeah, so we were one of the early adopters of the code. So I think Jennifer's already covered a lot of it, but what that means is that we are currently measuring our CO2 emissions. We've set targets, we have a plan in place, and it's in order to sign up to the code, but it's been checked, it's been verified and approved independently. It came off the back of us launching our own, or publishing our own roadmap to zero carbon back in 2020, which feels like a long time ago now. And we've started to take concrete action to move towards net zero, looking at what initiatives we can put in place to reduce our scope 1 and scope 2 emissions in the first instance. So what we have done is we've looked at the areas which are under our direct control. So our office building, looking at the energy use, transport, looking at the vehicle emissions, waste, water use, and also procurement as well. So these are the things that we can easily control, and they can have a high impact as well. So one of the things we started looking at was transport footprint, and that was one of the things on our roadmap, and it's sort of how we structured our roadmap really. That was one of the things that we thought that we could easily look at. In terms of measuring our footprint, there's a lot of carbon dashboards and digital tools out there to make carbon measurement viable for organisations and for smaller organisations, and make them accountable. We've used a platform called Zeller, which is actually specifically designed for SMEs. and it's allowed us to input our scope 1 and scope 2. And we've got like an online profile, and again, that's visible, and it's also benchmarked in the industry.
Can you spell that for us, for viewers?
Yes, ZELLEAR.
Great, thanks.
There's a lot of free information and resources out there, like Jennifer said. The Supply Chain Sustainability School, there's the SME Climate Hub. We're also members of the National Federation of Builders. They offer a lot of resources as well. I think on the SME Climate Hub, there's also a business carbon calculator, which is free as well. And for me personally, it's about making sure what we're doing in the office, so things like signing up to the code, is then translated to what we're doing out on the construction sites, in those design meetings, in those client meetings, and the conversations we're having with our supply chain as well. I want to ask you specifically about that, actually, because Jennifer brought up the subject of collaboration there, and I wonder how the tool has helped you engage with the supply chain. Yeah, definitely. Well, I think I was going to make a point later on, actually, that when we're talking about supply chain and bringing them on the journey with us, that we can also learn from the supply chain as well. So a lot of them, they've been using these modern technologies for a number of years, and I think there's a lot that we can learn from them as well, and I think it's definitely a two-way thing, and I think it's playing to their strengths and then using our experience to then help them look at other things, maybe like efficient working practices on site. We can help them with that, but they can certainly help us as well. Great stuff, Sarah. Thank you very much. Gavin, how appropriate is this client side?
I think it could be quite appropriate. I mean, councils are facing all sorts of challenges that this tool could help to address. I mean, I think as Sarah mentioned earlier, there's a huge looking at cost at the moment of who pays for what. Is it the clients? Is it the suppliers for the cost of this change? But to be honest, there's a lack of consistency across local authorities at the moment in looking at carbon and how we can measure it across each of our supply chains without coming up with some 330 different solutions, because that's the number of councils there are. So there's a whole lot of effort looking at how we can look at carbon, especially in large sort of construction projects. Can we put in sort of minimum standards as well? So I think Letty was mentioned earlier. Some councils might start looking to have that as a minimum standard or something similar. There's also the question of how do we measure emissions? What tool do we use? Do we need 50 different tools for the various scope that councils each procure? So there's a lot of work to be done in the whole space, and I think this tool could definitely contribute towards that. And how are local authorities working together? How important is that collaboration piece? So it's a new beginnings, really. I'm working with the LGA as well as many other local authorities, and we're trying to look at where we can collaborate, what we can collaborate on. Is there resource or efficiency or time savings that we can have by working together, and then just try and make the whole picture clearer for suppliers, really, as well as ourselves. Great stuff, Gavin. Thanks. I'm going to launch a poll now asking our viewers if they'd like some more information about the code, and let's turn to the frameworks while they respond to that. Emma, where do you see the use of the carbon code?
Yeah, it was a great lead-in, Gavin, actually, to consistency of reporting, which I talked about earlier. And I think that's the point of the code. It raises those questions. It makes you examine what you're doing at the moment, and again, it should be to help you baseline that and move it forward. So I think adopting the code again provides that consistency across the NACF partners. Therefore, it carries more weight. Of course it does, because there are more people signed up to it. It becomes more recognizable. And again, I like the gateway process as well, so you can progress through the code, which I think is really important. Just to caveat that, there are a few things we can't do as a framework under the code, but certainly contractors and those bodies that are responsible directly for the procurement certainly can progress through it. So yeah, I think baseline is really very important. And there was a question that came up on the Q&A and what we're doing in order to make sure that that consistency is there. And that is the point. And this is quite innovative in an NACF environment where we do collaborate on such a technical tool as this carbon baseline reporting tool. This keeps popping up on my screen, that we do collaborate with. So we're asking the same questions of the same partners, and we're ensuring that we have potentially national data that we can share, and we are able to therefore extract trends, analysis, and from our perspective, as a framework, early engagement is absolutely critical. It's mandated through the framework. So we want to see those progressions, or those differences between the gateways, PCSA, prior to construction and then post-construction. So it's important. All of this data, you can only improve if you know what the baseline is. And I know I keep labouring the point, but under this tool and sharing it across 3 frameworks at the moment, and more are coming on daily, we're asking for the same information from a wide range of partners with different levels of capacity and capability and size, and therefore we'll have some really powerful national data in which to improve. And the code has, the Cambridge Code has sort of pushed us towards that. So yes, it's critical.
Fantastic, thanks, Emma. Now I want to turn to Chris next. Jennifer, I know you want to come in, and we'll come to you in just a second. But Chris, I mean, we need real behavioural change, don't we? How far is this? How far do you experience members and clients coming to you and asking you for measures like this, asking for help on delivering net zero? And how far do you feel you're having to push?
Incredibly diverse position, Toby, from clients who haven't even thought to ask to clients who are demanding far more than we're ready to give. And that's expected. You know, there are people out there who you have to say are elite clients who have got everything sorted, and they're beyond what any of the frameworks are able to do. And part of the reason for that is the frameworks have to work in a way that's consistent across a lot of people. So we have to be careful not to exceed the capability of everybody. So that said, we've done some work in the last 6 months working alongside clients where we're looking at what you have to do differently to make net zero projects happen, what the actions that you have to take and the outcomes that can achieve. And we've been doing comparative analysis on not asking and asking for low carbon outcomes, and the things that change. And I think that engagement has received a huge amount of airtime and interest from clients because they want to understand what the steps they can take are. I think the most immediate sort of 3 observations I pick up in that conversation that we're having that are coming out the most. The first thing is, nothing happens by chance. As a client, if you want to reduce carbon in projects, you have to ask for that to happen. Your brief starts everything. So that's point number 1, and we've been talking to clients about what that brief can look like, and we've written some recommended standards that help with that. The second point is, if you're going to set targets on carbon, you've got to have carbon literate project teams. You've got to have somebody in the project team who's going to take responsibility for measuring the carbon in the project, whether that's a contractor, a consultant, or somebody on the client team. Someone has got to have to be, if you like, the cost manager for the carbon account, and that role has to be fulfilled. You don't have that person doing that job, or that activity being done somewhere in the project, you're not going to know. And the third thing is, you've got to start somewhere. And I think the message we keep giving clients is, don't apologise if you're not quite ready to go all the way to a target that perhaps we'd all idealise is the right one. Maybe you can't convince your organisation you can afford to set a target that's all the way to the net zero target today, but maybe in 2 years' time. Yeah. But I think we made the point earlier, carbon reduction, greenhouse gas emission reduction that we do this year and next year has exponentially more value than carbon reduction in 2029. You know, the things we do now have a more material impact than the things we do tomorrow. And this is, so our message to clients is, do something different. You don't have to get it all right, but start. And the code helps give people a bar to jump towards, which I think is really helpful.
And it's really interesting. And Jennifer, we're coming to you now. And just to interject with the poll results of the audience, there are 13% of our audience out there who aren't actually being asked to measure carbon yet, and 13% who aren't sure, which may be that it's not applicable, or maybe are also no. So that could be as many as a quarter of people watching that still aren't being asked to do this. So there's a real need, yeah?
Yes, absolutely. I was going to respond on something Chris said, but I've now completely forgotten what it was. So, but I will re-emphasize his point about, a ton of carbon saved today is worth a huge amount more than a ton of carbon saved in 5 years. And all of that is worth a huge amount more than a ton of carbon saved in 2050. So the more we can do now to reduce, and every little step you can take counts. So take baby steps to start with, and then what you'll realize is you can take bigger steps. Oh, I know what the other thing was. On the cost piece, we have worked, so Anglian Water, who some of you will be aware of, one of the major water utilities in the UK, back in 2010, they took the bold step of saying, we want to see carbon reduction on every one of our capital projects. And everyone could have sort of sucked through their teeth and said, it's going to cost you. Actually, what they found was it cost less. Because in order to reduce carbon, you have to reduce materials. The whole thing snowballed. And they didn't ask for a cost reduction, they asked for a carbon reduction, but it turned out that it cost them less. So I think these things can seem a bit sort of scary and daunting, but actually often, if you set a target, then the industry is very good at responding to targets. If they do nothing else well, that they're fantastic at, and they do many other things well as well. But as is an industry that responds to targets and responds to the client asking. So please do ask. The other thing, people were talking about consistency, and I just emphasise that NACF did a really good job of coming up with a set of KPIs, or a KPI that can be used as part of the procurement frameworks. So it sort of take some of the sweat out of it for the various frameworks that are signed up to NACF. So do take a look at that. And that was specifically done to make it slightly less painful for you all when you're actually going to the procurement level. I mean, obviously, prior to that, there's all the piece about having your own sort of carbon plans in place. But I think that's
thanks, Jennifer. Thanks. Sarah.
Sorry, I was just going to pick up on a point Chris made earlier about having someone who is carbon literate and responsible for carbon on a project. And that's something that we're really keen to make sure that we're giving our employees, giving them the ability to identify their own role that they have to play in achieving our carbon target. So one of the ways we've done this is a lot of our employees have gone on the carbon literacy training, which is run by the Carbon Literacy Project. And it really helps give awareness of the impacts of carbon and give people hopefully the motivation and the ability to go out there and work with the teams and empower individuals to act on climate change. So it's just a point on that.
Yeah, thanks very much, Sarah. Emma, I just we'll come to Chris, because I think Chris wanted to make a point as well. But just before that, I want to introduce or reintroduce this theme of collaboration and understand a little bit about what Sarah's been talking about there, what Jennifer's talked about before, and Gavin, the need for organisations and teams within organisations to work together to really understand the imperative for reducing carbon, but also some of the processes and the tools and the kind of the jargon, the expertise and the acronyms.
Yeah, it is a bit, and of course, define a team in construction. Is it the framework? Is it the client? Is it the consultants? Is it the delivery team? Is it the pre-construction team, etc., etc.? So we're talking about influencing something which is a movable feast, particularly as you progress through a construction project. And I think the purpose of, in my opinion, the purpose of a lot of the work we do as a framework is to make sure those discussions are happening. We are limited in the amount of influence that we can have on an eventual design. What we can ensure is those discussions are almost mandated throughout the process and through each one of those teams. So on a launch meeting, for example, on our agenda for the launch meeting, it says, have you discussed the carbon tool, which is mandated through our framework and will be through and is already through the other frameworks, to make sure those sorts of discussions are happening. And the construction cannot happen without teamwork. It can't happen without appreciating each other's agenda and understanding what those key drivers are. And we shouldn't always put a carbon up against cost, because that's not always the case. And this is the ongoing argument. CapEx and OpEx, operational running costs and capital running costs, they should be, in a healthy discussion, they should be merged. So actually you can invest in the mechanical and electrical part functionality of a building to make sure you've got the long-term gains there in the operational carbon performance of that building, as well as look at the embodied part of it. So it's such a massive subject, and we have limited influence. What we can do, as I've said, is make sure that we're working with other framework partners under NACF to make sure there's consistent messaging. There is a tool which is going to provide data back, because we all collect data, sometimes it just disappears in the ether. So it's got to be something that's actually useful to those feeding in into the tool. So partnership is key. Define team. I defy anyone to define a team in construction process, and then see what we can do within those limitations. And as I said, the tool has allowed webinars like today to happen and to sort of spread that message and just get different parts.
Thank you. Gavin, just turn to client side again, because you mentioned that you might end up with 300 odd different sort of sets of ways of measuring carbon use. Trust is an issue that we constantly come back to in any talks of sort of partnership and collaboration and so on. How realistic is it that lots and lots and lots of local authorities will all start following the same sorts of measures, and how helpful is it for something like the carbon code in making that process happen? And then beyond that, how realistic is it to ask us, for the public sector clients and the private sector contractors and suppliers, to really work together on this? So there's always that feeling somewhere in there someone's being ripped off. We're paying too much for this, they're taking the mick. How do you get over that hurdle?
I think that's a great question, and one that we'll probably still tackle as we go forwards. In terms of getting everyone to collaborate together, I think it is possible. We've started working quite closely with the LGA, as I mentioned earlier, and councils like NEPO, which is for the Northeast procurement, which I think is 12 different local authorities. So there is the potential to work together there, and already if those two just together work, collaborate, then that's 15 less tools going around. So it is definitely possible to make some things more efficient for suppliers, and work together and try not to make it so that there's this feeling of distrust. I mean, we're looking to support suppliers as much as we can in our sort of carbon reduction journey. We all three authorities or localities are using what's called low case at the moment, which is a low carbon grant fund available for local SMEs. And that's to pay for partly for their sort of low carbon investments. So that might be improving building insulation or installing solar panels or something like that, just to try and kickstart the market in that way. And that's not necessarily just for our suppliers, that's for any local business in those localities. They can access that funding if they have something that they're working towards.
Fantastic, Gavin. Thank you very much. Now we're nearly out of time. So Jennifer, I'm going to give you the last word. What are your hopes for the carbon code over the next 12 months? What do you want to achieve?
Gosh, I'd like to see a whole range of organisations signing up. I think you as frameworks have huge clout, both by signing up yourselves, but then by, through the signing up or through working on PPN, I621, etc. You can bring an entire supply chain with you. The people running the code at the moment is basically me and my colleague Dee Dee in our spare time. So we're in the background, we're looking for ways to sort of fund this sustainably going forward, because we don't want to have to charge people, or if we do, a small admin fee is all we want to have to charge. But we're determined to keep it going because we think it's hugely valuable. It brings the whole supply chain together to focus on actually what are we doing, what are we achieving, and actually measuring the progress we're making, because that's been one of the challenges so far. is knowing how much of a difference we're making, and are we running fast enough?
Fantastic, Jennifer. Thank you very much. We're ending with a call to action, which is terrific. I know you got the NACF support at the very least. Viewers, get out there and sign up to the Carbon Code immediately. But just before you do that, join me in thanking our brilliant panel for sparing their valuable time to share their knowledge and experience with us today. Thank you to Sarah Barnes from Interclass, and thank you to Emma Ball from SCF. And thank you to Chris Clark from Scape. Thank you to Gavin Marshall from Orbis Procurement. Thank you, Dr. Jennifer Schooling, OBE from the University of Cambridge. And thank you as well, of course, to the NACF for instigating and supporting this session and encouraging conversation and collaboration and shared learning among public sector colleagues and private sector partners. And that's you, viewers. And as ever, thank you as well for tuning in and for gracing us with your attention and fueling the conversation with loads of questions. I think they've all been answered, but if any are left hanging, join our LinkedIn Members Club and you'll find responses from the panel circulated there over coming days. Now, the next thing on our agenda is the ingredients fueling a number of spectacular built environment growth companies through the past 2 years and beyond. And we'll be joining Rapport 3 and their special guests for that on the 26th of May at 11 AM. Registration details are in the chat now. And we hope to see housing colleagues at the Direct Delivery Awards on the 24th. Until then, from our fabulous panel, from the National Association of Construction Frameworks, and from me and everyone at 3Fox, good afternoon.